Hi there, my name is Zach Kath-Nelson and I run the sales team at Klipfolio. Today we're going to talk about modeling your data. We'll cover what the modeler is in Klipfolio, several scenarios where modeling your data is helpful, and some powerful tips and tricks. First, a bit of context. Here I've got a data source that I've created. Simple data, nice and clean and tabular. One thing you may not know, a data source in Klipfolio, whether it's structured like this, whether it's from Salesforce or Twitter, tabular or JSON data, when we bring it into Klipfolio, Klipfolio is not aware of very much about the data. In other words, we keep it as raw data. We don't really understand that this is text, this is a date, or this is a number. In several areas of the platform, we make some inferences about data format, but we don't really make full use of it. Instead, we keep it in a raw data format. Enter the modeler. So what is the modeler? The modeler is an interface where your data gets normalized and understood. It's similar to an ETL tool where you might extract, transform, and load your data. A lot of that process, specifically the transformation, is optional. And the modeler itself is optional if you're building clips. You can do some really nice, powerful things, but you don't really have to. I've decided to model my data. If everything looks good to me, if I've validated that Klipfolio correctly interpreted the data formats, as we did here, then I can simply save and exit. And if I was building a clip, modeling my data does a number of things for me, and there's a number of value propositions. And if I'm building a clip, modeling does have a number of advantages, so I could simply save and exit. But I do have the ability to do some really powerful things here. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but really powerful things around transforming what the data actually is in the modeler. Optional for clips, modeling is required for power metrics. And in fact, modeled data is actually what enables power metrics. Remember that when data is in a raw format, Klipfolio doesn't really understand what it is. And that's why on the clip side, while you have massive power and massive flexibility, the onus is really on the user to make every single decision about how data is visualized, what items go on the x-axis, what goes on the series, how data is sorted. Modeler, on the other hand, as soon as we understand the data, we can do magical things with it, and that's really where power metrics come in, and we'll show that a little bit later. The architecture of a modeled data source is that the model is forever tied to the underlying data source. The two are separate, and if I go back one step and look at our list of data sources in this trial account, I see slightly different icons. This icon over here shows me this is a modeled data source. This one is as well. The underlying data sources exist separately, and it's the underlying data sources that actually refresh at whatever interval you've chosen. The model will always refresh in line with the underlying data. So why would you want to model your data in Klipfolio? Well, there's two main reasons. One reason to model your data is if you're building a power metric, and you don't really have a choice in this regard. Modeling your data is required in a power metric. Scenario number two, you might want to model your data if you're building a clip for various different reasons. Number one, headers are smartly remembered and automatically removed from a table column or removed from a series or x-axis. The header names are smartly remembered, so you don't have to rename items in the menu. They'll just automatically populate. But the larger reason would be that the modeler can be one central place where you capture and apply complex formula logic. Something like a lookup with many group bys within it. Logic that you know out of a single data source, you're going to have to apply to one clip in a certain context and another clip in slightly different context, but you're always reapplying that core logic. The modeler actually gives you the ability to apply that formula right in here. So you can use the same library of functions and formulas that you would use in the clip editor right here in the modeler to essentially apply that logic one single time and code it into the data source instead of having to replicate it over and over multiple times in the clip editor, in different clips or different components. That would be a very compelling reason to model your data if you were building a clip. Let's move on to our tips and tricks. And to illustrate some of these concepts, I'm actually not going to apply any of those tips in the first round. We've modeled our data. Let's go create a power metric. We're going to quickly jump through a few steps here. We've chosen our data source. We're going to measure the number of clips. We're going to imagine this is something more compelling like revenue or site visits. We're going to choose the dimensions by which we want to look at our metric value. The date. This is transactional data. We'll just keep the name as is. And let's look at the output of what we've created. So remember, we made no changes to the structure of this data. And here we have an extremely noisy chart. While factually correct, let's narrow down this date range a little bit. I have so many different lines. How can I possibly interpret this? And while this data is accurate, there's just too much of it. Looking at this metric value by country, it's so hard to really understand what's going on. Regardless of how I slice and dice this, these charts are just going to be too noisy for a user to quickly look at this and understand what's happening in the data. So let's delete this and show you what we might do instead. So let's go back to our model data source and let's make some slight edits to it. So some of the things that I find I do often in a model is really around cleaning up the data. So I'm going to show you two examples today. One, I want to clean up some of this numerical data. So remember, the power metric that we're going to build is going to look at the number of clips as our metric value. I've got some interesting information over here, but right now it's not really in a usable format. Again, while it's accurate, the lead score on this record is 455, it's not really usable for me. Instead, I'm going to turn it into a nice dimension. Really, I'm going to lower the number of unique values so I can slice and dice by this. So a nice way to bucket numerical data is with the ceiling function. I'm going to take every number in here and round it to the nearest 500. I need to give it a new title. And now all of a sudden I've got a nice dimension that I can use. And I'm going to do something similar for our country field. This was really what we had a problem with on our line chart, just too much going on in the chart. So I've pre-written a little formula to save time. So let's grab that quickly. So I'll walk you through what's happening here. I'm using the if function. My condition is that if the data in column F is in one of these items, basically I've written an array of values. If the country is the United States, Canada, or multiple others, I don't want to actually show the name of the country. Instead, I want to call it a top geography. And if that condition is not true, I'm just going to call it other. This list of countries is meaningful for us, but really what's important is that I'm paring down a long list of unique values into something much more manageable and much more readable. And we'll see the output of that in a second. So let's give this a good name. Perfect. So two simple changes to our model. Everything else remains unchanged. Remember, a model is always going to refresh in turn with the underlying data. So the bucketing is not happening in the underlying data source. This data is coming in directly from the source. But every time it refreshes, when the model refreshes in turn, the formula logic is going to be applied and we'll see the data that we were hoping for. So that's all we're going to do here. I'm going to save and exit. And let's create a new power metric and see if we can show some improvements. Quick reminder, if you have not yet seen our Introduction to Power Metrics video, I'd highly recommend it. You'll go through this process in much more detail. Our metric value is going to be number of clips. And now we can choose lead score as a dimension. Let's add page category as well. Same date column. This is transactional data where every row is a new record. Let's give it a new and improved name. And let's see what it looks like this time around. So here, let's go back to a line chart, and we will decide to segment this by region. And if we narrow down the date range a little bit, even though I lose some of the granularity, the chart is immediately so much more readable. I can see that our business is performing quite well in some other geographies, in certain segments, and some of the top geographies are moving in the wrong direction. Whereas previously, no one could interpret what was happening. There was just so much going on. I can also choose to segment by none and apply things like a trend line or a comparison field. Let's look at what we can do with our lead score. So here we go, a number of different options, and maybe you'd argue that there are still too many, but previously we didn't even have the ability to use this as a dimension. It was a numerical value. We could look at the unique values of every single row, but we couldn't look at anything from a higher level view. So some powerful tips and tricks I've employed here to take some really nice, really granular data and just pare it down into a more usable format. So today we covered what the modeler is in Klipfolio, when and where you might want to model your data, and a number of tips and tricks that I hope you found useful. Tips around bucketing your data to make it a little bit more usable and make your charts a little bit more readable. Next time, we will cover joining multiple disparate data sources together in the modeler on a common field. That one deserves a video all on its own. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you found it useful, please give it a like. If you have any questions or comments, please pop them in the comments thread below. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great day and happy dashboarding. Bye for now.